Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, a show on India's national television channel Doordarshan about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations and strategic moves being made by important countries around the world that have a bearing on India's rise. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking a deep look at a phenomenon that has been rattling regional security and order in Asia. This is grey zone warfare by the People's Republic of China. What is grey zone warfare and why is China using it to great effect, and how can targeted countries fight back and push back? This is the theme of this episode. And to discuss this, I have with me a specialist on this subject, Ray Powell, who is the founder and director of SeaLight, which is a research organization based in San Francisco, California, and is part of Stanford University, one of the leading higher education institutions in the United States. Ray, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Ray, you are, shining light through SeaLight on this nefarious phenomenon of China's grey zone warfare. But for the information and understanding of our audiences, let's start with the basics. What is this grey zone warfare, and what are its manifestations? How do states use this? And we can then go to China in particular. But let's start with the definitional aspects and why we should pay attention to this phenomenon of grey zone warfare.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I think what you have to think about is those of us in sort of the traditional way of looking at questions of peace and war, we tend to have a very neat sort of separation between the two. Over here is war, people are shooting at one another, there's violence, and there's a state of war between two countries. Over here is peace, where that people don't do those things. What countries that engage, gray zone actors engage in, is a whole series of activities that are highly aggressive, but they don't sort of trip the triggers that identify it as war. And so, whereas we tend to be very neat in our definitions, these kinds of things are very shadowy. They're very opaque and deniable. So that's the kind of way that the gray zone actor looks at things. How much can I get away with without triggering a what we would consider an actual war?
Right. So Ray, it's in the gray zone, literally between peace and war, and it involves coercive and aggressive actions, but which, as you say, fall below the threshold of all-out war. So it's obviously fuzzier, and often many people are confused as to what it indicates and what it signifies. So viewers, this is an important point to keep in mind. Let's first understand the nature of the beast. So many countries resort to grey zone warfare, but especially authoritarian countries, and China is probably the #1 practitioner of this in the world today. So Ray, Chinese strategy and strategic thought, deception and doing things slyly has always been part of their strategic culture, and even from their ancient texts until contemporary times. So when you look at China, it's already conventionally very powerful country, right? I mean, it's considered a great power today, close on the heels of the United States, and far ahead of most other rivals and adversaries and neighbors in Asia. So in that context, when you're so powerful, why do you even need to resort to these grey zone tactics at all? I mean, why can't you just use all-out brutal coercive military force? I mean, why do they do this kind of underhanded or illegitimate, illegal tactics, and why do they try to do this consistently as part of a strategy or a pattern?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the thing to start with is understanding that China is essentially an expansionist state. So it sees itself as having earned by the virtue of its history and its status as a great power, the right to more territory, more maritime claims than it has now. And so it believes very strongly, and it's part of its national mythology, that China, the proper role of China is much larger, the proper territory of China is much larger than it is today. And so this is a way of it going out to get that territory, but China itself has not actually been engaged in war, and certainly not any kind of successful war in a very long time. Its last experience with war was with Vietnam back in 1979. That didn't actually go very well. And so its experience in war is pretty limited, and it's not really sure that it wants to or that it could be successful if it were to engage in an actual war. And, of course, countries don't necessarily want to go to war. But the other thing to remember is gray zone warfare is working. So, China has been expanding the amount of say, the water, the maritime space that it controls in the East and the South, especially the South China Seas. You in India have seen it along the Himalayan border there, have seen it trying to expand its territory. And a lot of these things just work. And part of the reason it works is because we tend to think, well, what we should do is find ways to de-escalate this situation. And China often thinks when we want to de-escalate, that's their opportunity to push even farther.
Yeah. This gray zone activity you've been tracking for a long time. It's a worldwide phenomenon. Russia also uses it to an extent in Europe and so many others. But China, will keep pushing the boundaries, is quite clear. So we will have to keep pushing back. And what is the essence of this phenomenon in terms of the larger geopolitical strategy of China? I mean, China, why does it even want territory? I mean, why do you think it wants territory? It's already a major economic power, and it's projected to overtake the US in GDP sometime or the other. So they will still remain a major power. So why is it that they are going for territory, and that too through these surreptitious means, so that we understand China, in its bare reality?
I would say there are three big elements there. One is that it has told itself a story about what its rights are. And it sort of, by telling itself its story, by telling every Chinese child who grows up and goes to school that this is what China has earned, that's one big thing. A second is that China looks out and sees itself sort of surrounded by unfriendly countries. It looks out and sees South Korea and Japan and the Philippines with the United States there, and it thinks we're surrounded, and yet the United States is able to be all the way over there, kind of enjoying itself with two big oceans and not have all of these. And and finally, I think China just believes that this is its time, and that as a great power, it has earned a certain sphere of influence, and it would like the United States to get out of that sphere. And so it's going to push until it achieves what it believes is its proper sphere. But the problem with that, of course, is we know that aggressor states are never satisfied. As far as they can go, they can always look and say, yeah, but we actually should get a little bit further.
So there is this confusion, I suppose, with targeted countries as to how to also respond, isn't it? Because the proportionate use of force to retaliate is not so clear in these cases. And like you're saying, it's incremental. So, and China, of course, people say has a long horizon, and they're running this 100-year marathon to dominate the world. And you said it's an imperial power. So obviously, they will take it one step at a time, slowly and gradually, and then lo and behold, after 5 or 10 years, you see that the status quo has completely changed, isn't it? And Ray, your organization has been highlighting a lot of such tactics that China is using in East Asia, in South China Sea in particular, and also in the East China Sea. Let's talk about what they're doing there. We do, of course, come across glaring global headlines about clashes between the Philippines and China, and Vietnam and China, Indonesia and China, and of course Taiwan, which is the big prize in this whole region, which China wants to reoccupy as part of its imperial expansion. So let's talk about what they're doing there, what your research is showing, and why we should be concerned or worried about it.
So I would say, especially for the last 2 years, we've seen China really sort of throw off the pretense of being kind of a benign power and really push hard. And this began really in the South China Sea with the Philippines, and the Philippines began to take this new tactic of exposing Chinese aggression. It began with some simple aggressions, the swarming of Chinese ships, the use of a laser in terms of, against a Philippine ship. These kinds of things, the Philippines, they did something very simple. They just turned on the cameras. They sent out embedded reporters. They had their Coast Guard ships bring along video and still cameras. And they began to put all of these things out into the world. And for about 6 months, China was really kind of on its back foot trying to figure out what to do about this, but finally decided that that its option was just to go in twice as hard and to try to make an example of the Philippines, to use a Chinese proverb, to kill the chicken to scare the monkey. And the idea is if they let the Philippines get away with this kind of standing up to China, then maybe Indonesia and Vietnam and Malaysia and other countries would do the same. So they really went after the Philippines. They began to surge ships down into the South China Sea, but the Philippines didn't back down and continued to try to expose the Chinese. And what the Philippines has sort of got for all of this is a renewed commitment from a lot of the international community, including quite a bit of support from India.
Yeah.
So, the Philippines has gained a lot, but at the same time, they have taken on a lot of risk because China has kind of now got itself in this situation that they almost really have to keep going after the Philippines because they don't want any other country to get the idea that they can do what the Philippines has done.
So it's intimidation. Viewers, it's mostly intimidation and browbeating smaller countries, but using other means of force short of big guns and heavy weapons, and they are still able to do this. And one of the points Ray Powell is making is about these maritime militias that they have, civilian vessels that actually are part of the military organization and are subservient and work under the People's Liberation Army Navy, and which are being used not just in that region of East Asia, but also in the Indian Ocean. We have the so-called little blue men who are now coming out in these boats and fishing trawlers and are trying to swarm certain areas, and then on that basis they will then establish a fait accompli. Ray, apart from these skirmishes that we are seeing with contesting countries, there's also this island building that China has done in that region, and by the last count, at least 3,200 acres of artificial islands that they have created, and now they have set up military bases there. So in a way, it's no longer gray, it has probably become white or black, if you want to call it, because they have now militarized those regions which are actually falling within the sovereign exclusive economic zones of neighboring countries. So this island building and this attempt to change the status quo over time and then say, here is a new fait accompli, and this is the new map, and this now belongs to China because we have always owned it. Let's talk a bit about this strategy that they have, and this real estate and the way they have literally and figuratively changed the geography of these maritime spaces.
Well, you brought up a couple of things that go together very well. One is the maritime militia, which, of course, as you mentioned, are ships that look like fishing ships, but they don't really fish. And in fact, many of them are purpose-built to be part of this paramilitary force, together with the China Coast Guard, much of which does not act anything like a Coast Guard in the traditional sense. Instead, they are built to intimidate, to be larger and be able to push you around. The largest of these is 3 times the size of the U.S. National Security Cutter. So it's meant to be the biggest thing in the water. And then you combine this with these artificial islands, which China has essentially used as power projection platforms to be able to push the Coast Guard, to push the militia, and to push the Navy deep into the South China Sea, whereas before it would have to go all the way back to, say, Hainan Island, very close to the Chinese mainland. Now they can remain in the South China Sea, very close to their neighbors' shores, and they don't have to go all the way back. And that has allowed China to occupy a much larger maritime space than before, to the extent where I have begun to refer to China in the West Philippine Sea as essentially being an occupying force, because that's the only way to really describe it now. They now control so much of the water that the Philippines just now finds completely inaccessible, that you really almost have to call it an occupation. And all of these elements work together in this gray zone space to bring this about.
Right. And although there's global attention, clearly there hasn't been a deterrent to this kind of action, and that's something we need to discuss. Ray, SeaLight has also highlighted gray zone activity of China on land. And I saw your recent report about what they're doing, nibbling away territory by establishing and building so-called civilian villages all along the borders with Nepal as well as Bhutan. Now, these are two what we consider to be buffer states. We lost the biggest buffer, which is Tibet, many decades ago, and China has come closer and closer and is breathing down our neck with its military pressure. And now we have these two left, which is Bhutan and Nepal, and there also China's encroachment is continuing, relentlessly. And you're showing how they build these infrastructure, build the fences, and then get deeper and deeper, and how they use their asymmetric advantage of power over these smaller Asian countries. So clearly the gray zone is not limited to maritime activity. So let's talk a bit about the land dimension of this and what they're doing. India, of course, is highly concerned, and it's a matter of grave national security for us, and yet we have not been able to fully stop these activities. So let's talk about the situation with Nepal and Bhutan and what you think is going on there, and how we can better detect and expose some of the work that you're already doing.
Well, I think, and all we've done in the case of Nepal and Bhutan is to highlight work that others have done. But really, it's a lot of the same thing. Now, it's maybe a little smaller in scale because we're talking about smaller areas, but we're also talking about very small states that are unable to really defend themselves. And so what you continue to do is you find ways to move the fence deeper into your neighbor's territory, right? Or you begin to conduct police actions on their side of their territory to go and get, say, people fleeing, Tibetans fleeing into their neighbors. And so China has essentially started to eliminate the sense that there is actually a border between themselves and these smaller states. And with the idea that over time, maybe the official boundaries don't move, but the effective boundaries move, right? So that China now has increased control over these buffer states, and which is why I think it's so important that India continues to draw a hard line. And because honestly, once China sees a little bit of a opportunity to push, they will push until they find, they find resistance. There's an old sort of Leninist saying that you probe with the bayonet, and if you meet mush, you keep pushing, but if you meet steel, you withdraw. So it's very important in the face of these things to show steel.
Yeah, resistance, of course, counterbalancing and resistance, no doubt about it. That's the key to stop imperial powers. That's been the lesson of history forever. And today we are facing this new imperial giant in Asia, and therefore we'll need to press all accelerators and leave no stone unturned. Ray, this what they call non-war military operations or quasi-war military operations, these are now being monitored and are being highlighted by organizations like yours. And we have satellite imagery, and the smaller countries are also sensitive, and they know that their sovereignty is at threat. And yet, like your organization has highlighted, there isn't enough of a pushback in the sense that we are not able to really defend these buffers or allies or partners. I mean, we meaning democracies. We've got the Quad coalition in this region, as you know. It's not exactly a military alliance, but there are security elements involved in the Quad grouping, which includes Japan, Australia, US, and India. And we are doing freedom of navigation operations. We are doing, sharing of intelligence, both on land and in the waters. At some points, where they have been trying to intrude directly into Indian territory, we have also thwarted Chinese attempts and have mobilized our soldiers to push back. But these buffer zones, which are in between, territories between the major powers, these seem to be the most vulnerable. So, what should be the approach of the defending countries as well as their partners going forward, you think? Because we have identified the problem, and China is pouring in a lot of resources into this gray zone warfare. And they seem to be focusing, like we said, on some long-term hegemonic ambitions, and they have a long-term hegemonic project in the region. So what should be the response, you think? And first, we should understand the problem, which is what you are all trying to do. But beyond that, in terms of policy responses, should we be actually standing, shoulder to shoulder with, say, the Philippines, or with Vietnam, or Indonesia, or Taiwan on that side, with Bhutan, Nepal, just to mention 2 countries on this side? Even across the Indian Ocean now, they are sending these so-called research vessels, which are out to simply gather information and then enable their military and their navy to expand into the Indian Ocean. So should we be actually doing something more proactive than what all we defending countries, or let's say status quo oriented countries, are doing to stop this revisionist juggernaut of China?
So I think that's really where we're at now, right? I think that you've properly identified that we have become very good at admiring the problem, and we haven't really become very good at coming up with policy solutions. So I begin always with the idea of transparency, because in democracies, it is very difficult to get democratically elected governments to focus on these issues when there are pressing domestic issues. So it's important to be able to show our own people what's going on, so that you can, sort of motivate them to put pressure on their lawmakers, on their chief executives, to do something about it. Because otherwise, they will naturally sort of default back to domestic issues, which is, natural. Secondly, I think we have to call it what it is. So I've become very used to calling it gray zone warfare, because it really is a form of warfare. China considers it a form of warfare. It's basically a kind of political warfare backed by force. So, understanding that, again, our neat definitions, we can't just say, well, we're not at war. Well, China kind of is at war. They actually are engaging in an expansionist enterprise. Now, of course, we don't want to go to actual, shooting war, but we have to have a sense of urgency about this, because what will happen if we don't is that they will change all of the facts on the ground, and by the time we get around to updating our lexicon and sort of wake up to the problem, they will have made several advances, like they did with the island building campaign in the South China Sea. The U.S., frankly, we were kind of inept. We were kind of caught flat-footed. We didn't really do very much, and they took that as permission. And so, understanding that if we give them if we sort of give them carte blanche, if we don't respond with a forceful response, they will take what we give them. So just developing a sense of urgency about these things is really important.
Yeah, give them an inch and they will, demand a yard. That's the Chinese playbook, and what we are seeing, viewers, is through gray zone warfare, they set up the platform for a more conquest and expansion. And this has become a menace because it threatens the security of so many countries. And they have this 3 warfares doctrine, and gray zone fits right in there. And through these means, they are able to try and change the status quo in their favor. So it's not a question of resources really, but maybe more of will and of coordination among multiple countries who are concerned. Because if Nepal looks at this purely as something that I can settle directly, bilaterally, by being nice to China, then it is doomed. Same with Bhutan. Same with any of the ASEAN countries who are in the line of fire. So I think we will need to, some kind of a broader coalition, and that's the only way to stop this. Because if we do one-on-one, then China has the asymmetric power advantage with all of us.
I will say, I honestly believe that India has a really key role to play in all of this, because, of course, when China looks at the world, it looks at the U.S. and its allies, and it sort of puts all of us in a big group. India, of course, has an independent foreign policy and is not one of the United States allies. And India can actually go into situations with quite a different sort of approach, So, for example, a couple of years ago, India got together with the ASEAN countries and conducted a naval exercise in the South China Sea within the 9-dash line. That, to my knowledge, that is the only time that the ASEAN countries have ever got together to do a military exercise within the 9-dash line. And it seems to have been because India was involved. They wouldn't have done it with the United States. They wouldn't have done it with the US ally, but they did it, and they don't do it by themselves, but they did it with India. So India actually has some cards to play in this that nobody else can play. And I think that, and you also mentioned the Quad. I think a lot of us believe that maybe it's time that the Quad starts to really kind of grow up and become what it can be. And again, it doesn't have to be an alliance. It doesn't have to be, but it can be much more than it is. And we the four large democracies of the Indo-Pacific have a lot of common interests in the security area that we should probably get around to addressing before it's too late.
Yeah, no, points well taken, Ray. So India is of course a central player, and we have capacities, we have resources, and like you said, we have quote unquote more legitimacy than a rival to China, a great power rival to China like the US. So it's more acceptable because these smaller countries don't want to quote unquote provoke China, but still they want to defend their security. So doing joint military work and intelligence sharing and coordination with a rising middle to rising power like India is probably safer bet for them than to be openly on the side of the US, because then they fear the wrath of the Chinese. So yes, very much so. I think we have to play a more proactive role. So viewers, the sum of this discussion with Ray Powell of SeaLight is that China is a neo-imperial power. It has a history of imperialism going back several centuries, which is now being resurrected under President Xi Jinping, and they are using gray zone tactics to expand their footprint and to enhance their geopolitical positioning and to push out the United States from Asia and to basically render the idea of the Indo-Pacific irrelevant. So they want to completely break up the idea of an Indo-Pacific which is based on rules and which is based on sovereign equality of nations. So this is a major threat, and this is something that we should be continuously keeping our eyes on the ball. It is not like all-out war or assault or occupation or invasion, but bit by bit, drip by drip, the Chinese are achieving, as Sun Tzu, the great Chinese strategist, would say, winning without fighting. And we cannot allow this to happen. I thank Ray Powell for being on the show and for guiding us about how to understand this phenomena in a deeper way, because knowledge is the first step before we take action. Let's all understand gray zone warfare better. Thank you, Ray Powell. Great work, and we will continue to follow you.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
So viewers, gray zone warfare is here to stay. We need to carefully study, analyze, probe every step that the Chinese are taking in the waters and on land, wherever they have contestation with neighboring countries, and we cannot let this pass. The point is, the more we give way, the more the Chinese are coming in, and the more we regret later on that we should have stopped them sooner. So it's time for action, but it's also time for deep contemplation and study. Let's all follow gray zone warfare and understand it in its nuances. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.